All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I guess for everybody on and anybody watching the recording, thank you for taking the time out of your day to walk through a little bit, just some ideas on how to right-size your Citrix investment. My name is Craig Jeske. I'm Director of Engineering here at GTRI. I've been working with Citrix product portfolio off and on for almost 20 years now, since I first touched WinFrame. So it's been around the block a little while, and it's definitely gotten more and more adopted throughout organizations across the country. As we go through how to right-size the Citrix investment, it's really looking at a couple of things, and it's starting out here as we go through the agendas. Where's the business going? Where are we today? What steps do I need to take to audit and assess my existing environment to plan to build my future environment? What security and access controls or concerns do I have to take into account? And then kind of the big pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is what types of options do I have to host my investment? What can I do to get into building the best, most economically feasible environment that will support the needs of the business both today and long term? So we'll get started. Please feel free to put anything in the chat window as you have questions. We'll get to them where they make sense, whether it's real time or at the end, and then we will go from there. So again, thank you all for joining me. Let's go ahead and get started. First question we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at how to plan for any new technology environment, but especially if we're looking for something like Citrix that is as core to a lot of organizations as it is, where's the business going? So first question, when we need to know where is the business going, is where is the business today? Where are we starting from? So if we look at it, hybrid deployments, this is from Network World back in May of this year. Today, the majority of organizations are still on-premise data centers. So 65% of enterprise-owned data centers where compute is being deployed. We're definitely seeing the shift over time from an on-premise to a hybrid and then to a cloud environment. But today, this is where we're living. We're largely running in our own personal data center. So that not a lot has changed there from a physical location, but we're starting to see movement. As we see that movement, one other thing we know, based on this Uptime Institute article, nobody's getting more money for data centers, whether that's being on-premise, whether it's new data centers, maintenance. Almost every single client that we're working with as an organization is working with smaller and smaller data centers or small and smaller data center budgets, building walls and data centers to cut the amount of space they need to cool, looking at what they can migrate to cloud environments or to co-location facilities. So I mean, the answer is in the data in this one. We're not getting more money. So what do we need to do as we sit down with the business? When we're designing a new environment for anything, again, but especially with Citrix, we need to look at what the business is doing, what are the business drivers that are going to drive what we need to provide for them. And I think any IT organization that's not sitting down and looking at the long term is going to run into issues. So I mean, all of these are fairly self-explanatory, but some of the big ones, at least that I run into and I come back to all the time, is security. If we're not looking at security first, it doesn't matter how much money we save, we're going to be in trouble long term, and we're going to spend a lot more money to get our security back. Number two is cloud. Whether or not we like it, it's the buzzword. CIOs are looking to move that direction a lot of times. CFOs are looking at how their balance sheets balance capital expenses versus operational expenses. It's all things we need to keep in mind as we move forward. Like I said, we need to align this to the business. We need to work with the business as we plan out our future infrastructure and our future IT environments. If we don't work with the business and we don't look at the organization's 3, 5, 7, and 10-year plan, we can design the best engineered system on the planet and they don't need it, and then they look at us as a cost center still because we just throw away a bunch of money building a Ferrari when we need a Honda, to go back to the old adage that everybody uses. Like I said, align it to the long-term plan. We need to have that conversation with the business and continue to be an asset to the business so that they start to see as we're right-sizing our investment, we're saving dollars as we redesign our environment, and we're saving dollars in support of their long-term plan. This is another one you hear from almost every Citrix engineer that has spent any amount of time in the field. We have to give the users what they want. The idea is that your environment today, tomorrow, and moving forward needs to be as good or better than if we just ran applications on the local desktop. We can do everything else to make the environment scalable, sized properly, efficient, saving money, If the users don't use it, I don't care how efficiently budgeted we were, it's a waste of money that nobody's going to touch. And then lastly, again, you're going to see this over and over from me, is that the security constraints. As we align our plan to the business, we have to take into account the specific security constraints that apply to our industry or our organization. We'll dig into that a little bit more when we talk about security at somewhat more depth. But again, that's something that I think needs to underlie every single decision we make as we design a data center and right-size our infrastructure. So auditing and assessment ideas. Like I said, we're going to look at a couple of things that you can start looking at when you're trying to right-size your Citrix infrastructure, or things that you need to take into account at the beginning. So the first one, kind of a foundational decision or foundational thought point. Where is my Citrix running today? A lot of the assessment questions about on-premise security, location, data throughput are not going to matter if you're already in AWS or if you're already in Azure full-time. It's extremely small percentage, but again, where is it running today? Is my office moving? Am I moving into a new data center that's going to give me an opportunity to buy all new hardware, or do I need to just look at taking advantage of what I have, maybe turning it off, leveraging power efficiencies more effectively to cut down on costs in other areas than hardware acquisition? Where are my applications? So this is a very, very big one for people that are not familiar with Citrix and for people that are familiar with Citrix to make sure we take into account. Is Citrix near my applications? And by near, I don't mean physically in the same data center, but am I logically or network performance connectivity-wise close enough to take advantage of the Citrix improvements? I can make the delivery of applications from my data center to my end user extremely effective, but if my data center is 500 milliseconds of latency away from my application running in AWS, Citrix is going to get blamed for all of the application performance issues. We have to make sure we take into account location of our data center and our applications. And then, like I just talked to, what is the bandwidth between my apps and my Citrix farm? If I'm delivering Office 365 applications, but I have high bandwidth from O365 to my Citrix farm, it might not matter that they're not in the same data center. It might not matter that I'm not parked in Azure, which has extremely fast cross connects to Office 365, given that Microsoft is always going to make Microsoft work well. Then what is my system performance? And this means on the Citrix environment itself, are my workstation or my virtual workstations set up to be optimized for the Citrix farm? Are my applications going to be configured? Do I have enough RAM, hard drive space, performance? Are users reporting issues? Then on the back end, are my systems over or underutilized? Am I throwing money away because I have 2 racks of storage that are running an incredibly high IOP count, but I have 100 users? I don't need all that space. I don't need all that maintenance cost to keep my NetApps and my EMCs running. I might be able to consolidate down to other things like an HCI infrastructure or to pure storage or something that's more modernized, specific to the application need. And then, again, am I appropriately tiering my storage? Do I have all of my user data running on flash? Maybe that does or does not make sense, depending on what my price point is, what I have available. If I'm in the cloud, am I running too many things on high-performance S3 storage, or do I need to cut some of that down, the long-term archive stuff, to Glacier or lower-cost S3 price points? And then hypervisor requirements, which is one I think a lot of organizations often overlook. As any Citrix person will tell you, Citrix will run on anything. Run on VMware, it'll run on Hyper-V, it'll run on Zen Server, it'll run on Nutanix Acropolis, it'll run on just about any hypervisor out there. Most organizations are running purely on vSphere. This is one place that I've been able to see significant cost savings for organizations, in the tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, depending on the maintenance renewal cost of vSphere. So of all the other things we look through, this may be one of the biggest areas that you can save money on when it comes to right-sizing your investment. Then areas to audit. Security again. What are my security and compliance requirements that I have to comply with? What are, we'll dig into that one a little bit more in a couple of minutes here. Another area to audit from a compliance and a cost perspective is licensing. What type of licensing am I using? Am I using enough? Am I using too little? Am I out of compliance that I'm worried about getting slapped with a fine and a get well plan, essentially, that's going to cost my organization significantly more than it should? Are all the applications I'm delivering through Citrix compliant? This is one that we have issues sometimes if we have users with a Zen desktop licensing out there that have admin rights. And they start installing something, and every 30 days they reinstall it to continue making it trial licenses. This is one I ran into at a former organization I was with, where we had so many users cheating the system that we got in trouble and we got slapped with some compliance violations based on the fact that people were trying to save the company money, but violating the license agreement they were clicking through and saying yes to. Then, am I leveraging licensing as efficiently as possible? And this breaks down to a couple of areas within Citrix we need to keep in mind. So specific to user device or concurrent, if I'm historically been paying a concurrent license cost, but let's say now I used to have 30% of my users logged on, now it's 60 to 70%. I really need to look at switching the license type I have to go to a user device and possibly license the entire company, because both upfront and on maintenance we could save a significant amount of money by getting ourselves to the intelligent licensing model as opposed to the one we're used to. Another one for multi-site organizations, and especially for multinational organizations, say they're going through acquisitions, mergers, or just growth into different areas of the country, need to make sure that we take into account the fact that a single centralized license server might allow us to share licenses more effectively. Do you have follow-the-globe development? Do you have 24/7 operations where I don't necessarily need to license everybody in the organization because I only have 1/3 of my users connecting at a time? If I centralize to one license server for all of my farms or multiple farms, it can let me take advantage of a lower number of licenses while at the same time continuing to provide the exact same amount of service and deliverables to my customer. And then legal obligations. We kind of weave that through there a little bit, but what are my legal obligations when it comes to data sovereignty? This is one that's starting to become a bigger and bigger issue as we see people that have locations in China and the US and the European Union. Each of those three has significantly different requirements when it comes to data sovereignty, data leaving the locations. China, in most cases, once the data lands, it can't leave. You have to make sure that if you have a farm there, everything's set up to keep data local, not allow data transfer out into other areas. Similar thing with the EU. If you have EU-based business, you have to make sure that your farms that are accessing EU-related data are co-located somewhere in the European Union. This is another one that's having a lot of impact on people's design decisions today with the Brexit move, with Great Britain threatening to continue with the plan to leave the European Union. Changes are coming to where data needs to live for companies that have locations, say, in Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. So as we design our farms, we need to make sure we don't trim too heavily and try to centralize too much and then violate legal requirements that are going to come back and bite us in the backside. And then data loss penalties. What happens if I'm hacked? What happens if we don't have things protected enough as we redesign it? I may have, again, saved money up front by streamlining everything, but I'm Home Depot, and now I'm cutting a check for tens of millions of dollars to provide everybody with credit monitoring because I lost everybody's social security number and personally identifiable information. I need to make sure that we stay in front of that as we're designing the infrastructure to check the security box again. And then when I'm compromised, what is going to happen to my reputation, both as an IT employee, as CIO, which costs a lot of jobs, and then to the organization, to Equifax, to Home Depot, to Target, to Kaiser Permanente, all of these organizations that you now think twice about giving your data to and giving your customer loyalty to because of things that have happened. That is not entirely on the Citrix architecture, the Citrix team, but it's something that needs to be kept in mind with every step as you go through designing any IT infrastructure, especially one if you're trying to design an IT infrastructure for cost savings. All right, so security and access concerns. This is a very important area to keep in mind when designing any infrastructure, but again, when you're designing an infrastructure with the idea of cost savings in mind. So what compliance standards do I have to follow? At GTRI, we work with the breadth of organizations across the industry, from government to finance to healthcare to classified information within the military. We worked with all three of these and then some to figure out how do we have to design our standards. What's my data mobility requirement? Can I have copy and paste? How do I have to separate data on the back end on the storage or hyperconverged to make sure that I am staying in compliance with everything, so if I get audited, I don't pay a fine, I don't pay a penalty. In certain organizations now, if you violate this NIST 800-53, you no longer have the ability to do business with parts of the federal government. If that is your business practice and you violate that because of a cost-cutting maneuver, again, I don't care how much money you save, you just cost the organization hundreds of thousands to millions to tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. So when right-sizing and we're looking at the monetary impact of lowering the cost of IT, we need to be able to explain to the business why we have to spend more money to maintain compliance. Your CISO will have your back on this. Anytime this comes up, security gets money today. When we're looking at these things, let's work with the security office to make sure that we're designing an adequate system to get funding to provide what the business needs. Again, designing this, and it'll come into play a lot when we look at hosting infrastructures and hosting options. Where do my security perimeters live? Is this FISMA low, moderate, or high? When we're looking in the federal side of things, is this non-classified, is this classified, is this in a top secret classification? Where do the perimeters live for each of those, and how do I deliver information across those borders? Am I allowed to deliver information across those borders, or do I need to make sure I have separate farms to completely segregate information across different security perimeters? And then, how do I have to harden my operating system? A lot of the various compliance standards have different hardening guides. Working with the STIGs, or the System Technical Integration Guides from the military, is often an excellent place to start. I see a lot of healthcare and finance companies actually use that as their starting baseline because as good or bad as it is, if it's good enough for the military, a lot of times it's as good or better than what's required in your compliance environments. So then, once we kind of know where we have to live from a security baseline perspective, what are my access baselines? What types of things can I do inside of Citrix that can impact, in this case, both how much back-end infrastructure I need as well as how much security I can provide to my organization? Little things like locking a screen, forcing timeouts, forcing log-offs is a place you can really start to cut down on the amount of equipment required on the back-end to host your Citrix infrastructure. If you have users that are only using it for a couple of applications, but you might have 500 users log on a day, maybe I can set a timeout because I know the average user only uses this application 30 minutes at a time. Set a timeout for 45 minutes. After 45 minutes, you just kill that session. Now, instead of having 500 sessions running at any given time, I may only have 125, which means I need 1/5 the amount of physical infrastructure, approximately, that I would need to serve all 500 constantly running, chewing up CPU, RAM, and back-end storage spindles. From a security perspective, this doesn't have as much of an impact on the actual infrastructure as it does making sure we stay in compliance and don't run into follow-on issues of compliance violation monetary penalties, is password and two-factor login requirements. This hits both the security, but it also circles back to user experience. So when we're configuring things like two-factor authentication, do we have the option to use derived credentials? Meaning I log into a workstation or a thin client with a CAP card, a PIV card, a smart card, and my login and password. Can I then pass those derived credentials throughout my session? Both at logon, say I come into a desktop and then log into a Zen desktop environment, but past that, in my Zen desktop environment, can I pass those derived credentials to my Zen app or to my software as a service applications to provide a better user experience that will increase adoption and user happiness? Access control policies, things like time that you can log on. This is big in call centers. This is big in shift work areas where you have risks of intellectual property compromise. If you can set your access times, so you can only access from 8 to 5 because that's what shift you work. If you try to log in at 7 o'clock because nobody's going to see you going and printing some some corporately protected information because you're going to sell Ford information to Chevy or to Toyota, this can show you when, A, did anybody attempt to log in that shouldn't be and why, but more importantly, B, it protects you from having people log in at inopportune times and chewing up compute cycles that increase the cost of your backend environment. Then location-based restrictions, and this is really more on the security side, where if I know that you're only supposed to log in from home as that call center user and I know your IP address, I'm not going to let you log in from vacation, because that's going to be a potentially more risky environment that data may leak, data may get out, data might be stolen, or it might not even be you and your password may have been compromised. So then getting into kind of hosting strategies, and this is the meat of it. When we're looking at optimizing or right-sizing our Citrix infrastructure from a cost savings perspective, or maybe we know it's not going to be cost savings, but the organization's told us, you need to operationalize your dollar spend, and I need you to move off of this on-premise equipment into a cloud environment, because I'm now going to report my financials on a monthly basis, and I don't want to have any capital equipment that I need to depreciate on the balance sheet. So here's the 4 basic options that you have in any type of environment when it comes to how you can host information, whether it's VDI, whether it's collaboration, whether it's software as a service or infrastructure as a service. We can run everything on-premise. We can do an on-premise managed service. We can do a personally hosted cloud-based system, or we can do a cloud-hosted and managed service. All of them provide different options that we need to look at and try and balance what the best blend of dollar monetary spend to the organization, security, performance, and cap or OpEx reporting for finance. For those familiar with Citrix Cloud, this is also one that you can run through the Citrix Cloud environment across all 4 of these to limit some of the management that you're required to do. So on-premise, we know, everybody knows it's going to be the largest capital investment. It's going to be generally the largest cost from an operating employee operations perspective, but it does give you the ultimate control over your environment because you own everything, good, bad, or ugly. You own the data center, you own the power, you own the cooling, you own the configuration of the operating system, you own the security, you own the premise, the firewalls, the security guards. Everything is owned by the organization. It can have great benefits, and sometimes this is still going to be required when you have applications, significant applications running in your on-premise data center. Places we see this a lot of times is companies that have custom-built applications that are antiquated and not cloud-ready, and maybe they're written in something that's not going to be movable to Amazon or Azure. Maybe it was written and it's only, it's required on Windows 2003 server. You're probably not going to get that in most of the cloud providers, so you're stuck running it in-house until the application team catches up. Managed service is an option that comes into play or makes sense when you're looking at trying to lower the amount of personal employee costs, or because you started to have staff leave and you don't want to backfill the staff, you'd rather outsource the management of the environment. Big things to take into consideration here that may have an impact on the actual bottom line of the company is software level agreement or service level agreements with your managed services provider. If I have an outage, how long do they have before they get my system online, before they start incurring monetary penalties? Other things to keep in mind when you're looking at a managed service here, cloud, or hosted and managed, is within that SLA, from a monetary perspective, what is their requirement? A lot of organizations or a lot of hosting providers will say, well, if I have $100 a month, my SLA is an hour, and then at an hour and a half, the firewall's not back up. They'll only reimburse you for the percentage that the firewall is of your overall bill, as opposed to the fact that your entire system is down, costing you money. So when looking at managed services, cloud, or hosted and managed environments, make sure you keep that in mind when you're looking at them. The other is cloud-based, and this is where the majority of companies are looking when they say, I'm moving to the cloud. They're not always looking for the full managed. They're looking to move the infrastructure, and in some cases, the software as a service out of their hands, but continue to manage it with their IT teams, with their development teams, with their application teams. This is the most common use case for AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Faction software, all of those different areas out there that we see a lot of customers moving to today. Then the last one is hosted and managed. And again, this is a hybrid of managed and cloud, and this is where you just say, you know what, I want to wipe my hands of all of this, my IT team is going to be down to a skeleton crew of 1 or 2 people, or maybe my IT team is purely my application guys, and everything else is outsourced to the folks that are going to run my Citrix environment, my infrastructure. That's the situation we see with this. It's definitely going to be a more expensive model in a lot of ways, depending on the size of your organization and your incumbent IT team, but it can be a great option when you want to operationalize every single dollar possible if your CFO has said this is the route we're going. So on-premise options, when we look at this, the first thing to keep in mind is status quo is always an option. The lowest cost Citrix environment, depending on where you are in your organizational life cycle, may be the one you already have. You might not have to make any or many changes in order to right-size your Citrix infrastructure. But that doesn't make it right. Because that's the way we've always done it is not the right answer. If you can look at your status quo and say, I am keeping it this way because I don't have to buy additional licenses, I don't have to buy additional hardware, everything is already prepaid for 3 years of maintenance, I have a team that knows how to manage this already, that is not overhead, is not more resources than we need, status quo could be exactly the right option, and you can make that case to the business on why you don't need to make a major change. And then the other choices, you could leverage more modern options. Depending on how old your environment is, it may make sense to look at things like convergent infrastructure, FlexPods, Flash Stacks, vBlocks, and other types of convergent infrastructure from various companies that let you scale compute and storage on demand or in the portions that you need, depending on what your requirements are. The other one that's got a lot of the buzz right now, and I guarantee everybody on this webinar has heard of, is hyperconverged infrastructure, HCI. Most people know it as Nutanix because they were the first to market, but now you have Nutanix, you have Cisco HyperFlex, you have Atlantis, I believe still has their product out there, SimpliVity through Hewlett-Packard, VxRail through Dell EMC. All of these are different options for hyperconverged. The advantage for hyperconverged that you can pitch up, and this is how they make a lot of success in the sales from the HCI infrastructure companies, really, really easy to manage. You can do it all through a single pane of glass. You don't have to worry about additional overhead. You don't need a storage guy. The downside of the hyperconverged, you're buying a block or you're buying a node every time you need to expand. That may make the most sense from a monetary and a management perspective. It may not. When you're looking at right-sizing your Citrix infrastructure, you really have to make sure you look at the actual costs and not just the marketing fluff. I encourage you to reach out to GTRI, other customers, other counterparts you have in the industry who have gone down the HCI or the converged infrastructure. Figure out what their experiences were, what was the good, what was the pain. Somebody else in your industry has probably done both, and you can get a real good idea of what makes the most sense for your specific business. GTRI can help look through these things where we can say, look, this is, HCI makes sense for you, you're a perfect fit, or based on your business, you need way too much storage. You're going to have so much unused compute on HCI that we don't want to go this route. The big underlying thing is don't go in a direction because you read it in a trade rag or you heard it at a trade show booth that this is the greatest thing ever. Marketing is not to be believed. Talk to the engineers. Talk to the geeks that have done it. They're always going to give you the true story and not the one that somebody wants you to hear. Other on-premise options are, we kind of went through this a little. I don't want to beat it to death, but you might have the requirement for multiple data centers and take that into account. If you have to have a data center in China, if you have to have one in the EU, if you have to have one in Australia because the latency to go run over across intercontinental fiber is just way too high, keep in mind the cost that that's going to bring in and whether or not a cloud computing option might make more sense. So you don't have to build out a new data center because Amazon's already got one in Asia Pacific. Azure's already got one in the EU in Cork, Ireland. These are all sorts of options you need to take into account when you're looking at whether or not on-prem or off actually costs more or saves money. And apologize, I hit these multiple times already. So the cloud options. There's two primary cloud options when we're looking at it. One is a private cloud. We can do an on-premise private cloud in your existing data center that allows you to keep your applications right next to your Citrix environment. You don't need to buy expensive bandwidth. and you can get the advantage of the automation that comes from private cloud, whether it's from a VMware, a Cisco option, an OpenStack, whatever those might be. The same thing with off-premise private cloud. And when I say off-premise in this case, I'm talking about co-location facilities like an Equinox or a CoreSite or somebody like that, where you already have all your equipment off-site in a data center where somebody else manages the physical security, power, and cooling, but I want a private cloud that I own and manage, and I want to park it in the rack right next to my applications. The other one, and the thing that most people think of when they say cloud, is obviously the public cloud. And the first one that comes to mind is AWS, Azure, and now Google, the hyperscale public cloud providers. This is where you can do anything you want on demand as long as you can script it, and a lot of options, some legal requirements to keep in mind. And as we look at right sizing from a cost perspective, one thing that bites people in the backside early on in their public cloud journey is the data out charges. So if your applications live in AWS today, and it is a client-server application that has a lot of chattiness back and forth, you probably want to put a XenApp server in the hyperscale cloud provider, whether it's AWS or Azure, because you want as little data coming out of that hyperscale cloud provider as possible. Otherwise, every month your CFO is going to be stroking a very large check to AWS, and that's going to last precisely 1 month before you and your counterparts in the IT department are going to get in very big trouble for making your CFO write a very large check that they were not ready for. Even if it means that you have a licensed server in one place, you run XenApp up in AWS, and you have XenApp on-premise, so you can have a Citrix instance as close as possible to all of your applications. The uplift in management costs and AWS compute costs very likely will overcome the cost of that bandwidth outcharge you would have paid for that chatty application. So architecture comes very big into effect when you're building applications in Citrix environments between hyperscale or off-premise cloud providers and an on-premise data center. And from a right sizing monetarily your infrastructure can have a very, very big impact on how you should be going about things. The other option when you come to a cloud perspective is, I call them here the other cloud providers. This is not the massive hyperscale cloud providers where 99.9% of your support is done via email. This is companies like a ViWest and a Faction and Softlayer who have a help desk you can reach out to and a person you can talk to. They generally have less or more flexible models around how much compute you need to buy, how much storage you need to buy, what your data out charge is going to be. The flip side, you may not have the same level of programmability and automation available as you would in some of the hyperscale cloud providers. Again, it's one when you're looking at the monetarily right-sizing your environment, you should probably look at what it's going to cost in either public cloud environment to do everything you need to do before you make a decision when it comes to the budget. And then the last one, just kind of thinking out loud, and then we'll open up for Q&A here. Do companies ever move from the cloud back to on-premise, or is it always a one-way trip? A lot of companies that we work with have moved from the public cloud back to on-premise based on the fact that they didn't realize the costs that were going to come from moving up. And we're in the middle of one who migrated to Azure, migrated back, and now we're helping them move back up into Azure now that they have a better idea of what all it's going to cost, and we've designed the applications to where they're going to work properly and not be sending so much data out of Azure to other locations. Another question that comes up oftentimes is does the industry we're in have anything to do with the deployment model? And I mean, I think everybody would agree that's a slam dunk yes. Depending on your compliance requirements, which again I beat to death, depending on your locations. You know, one of our large customers is a large multinational resource firm that pulls things out of the ground. Now I got sites in Australia and Africa. That's going to have a big impact on how I'm going to design this. Do I need a mini pop-up data center at each mine site? Can I get away with going to the cloud? Does my bandwidth have that ability? That's going to be very common in oil and gas and mining where your bandwidth limited. If we're working with the military and we have classification requirements, that definitely is going to impact which cloud I can go to. Do I have compliance requirements like PCI or Sarbanes-Oxley that mean I have to go to a specific cloud? Yes, we got to take all of that into account when we're designing our architecture. Users are all over the world. How does that affect security in a cloud environment versus on-premise? And this isn't as much to whether or not you should go cloud or on-premise, but this comes into account of what level of encryption do I need to make sure I'm using? Do I need to have VPN tunnels? Do I need to have point-to-points between the different sites? Is standard built-in Citrix Zen desktop encryption going to be enough? And that's something you need to look at. Do I need virtual private cloud? Do I need a full private cloud? Do I have to stay on-premise because of the compliance requirements? All questions you need to ask when you're assessing the future state Citrix environment to size it right, both from a location and security perspective. So what cost questions need to be considered? I think we talked through quite a few of these, but highlights to look at are, is current state good enough? Do I need to buy anything? Or can I just kind of readjust what I already own to make it work without having to drop tens, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars on a new architecture? If I'm moving to the cloud, what do I need to take into account beyond compute cost? Storage costs can balloon. If you can decrement data down to Glacier from S3 and AWS as you move along, if you do a cross-connected storage for your user profiles as opposed to running all of that in S3 because it might cost less on a monthly basis from a Zadara, which is operational expenditures, or from a pure NetApp that's just going to be a standard storage buy. What are my data out charges? What are my interconnect charges between my private data centers that I'm going to need to pay to, AT&T or Verizon in order to have the performance to get from my application to my Citrix environment? So those are the high-level ones. If anybody has questions, can go ahead and put them in the chat room. Otherwise, I will thank you all for attending today. My email address is on the bottom here. If you have any questions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to reach out. I look forward to hearing from you, look forward to working with all of you. And again, thank you for joining us today.